Hi, this is Jim Steinmeyer. Welcome to the April issue of Genii magazine and the April video column, Genii Speak. This is my chance to tell you about what's inside the magazine and the latest news. I don't have a lot to say this month because it's all inside the magazine. This is a perfect issue to sit down with, start at the cover, and turn the pages and go straight through. I think you're going to find wonderful surprises inside from our columnists, from our magic features, and of course, from our feature stories. On the cover, you're going to see an image of Torino, Italy, a street performer in Torino. If Torino sounds familiar to you this year, as we say in America, Turin, Italy, it's because that's where FISM is occurring this summer. Walter Rolfa has put together some real surprises for the FISM convention this year. We hope we're going to see you there. And inside that convention, inside the story behind that convention, you're going to read about some of those features and surprises. One of those is a new feature on street performers who are going to be part of the competition this year. That's why we have a street performer in Torino on the cover. As we talk about street performers, you're going to see a feature story inside about Covent Garden. It came to us from one of those Covent Garden performers, Laurence Gibbons, who is known as Abel of Cain and Abel. And we're going to be talking to him a little bit about that later. And then the third feature is about America's great reformed gambler, Jonathan Green. The story came to us from Paul Heller, who wrote it as a real slice of Americana. It's a great American literary story. It's a great story about a character and a famous, infamous gambler who became a reformed gambler. But it also has ties to the magic world, important ties. And we were able to really dissect that through the use of two great magicians and writers, Lee Asher, who you've probably seen perform. Lee has an impressive collection of antique playing cards and is very knowledgeable about the history of it. And so that piece is illustrated, I'm proud to say, with beautiful images of antique playing cards, which were all part of that story with Jonathan Green during his lifetime. And then the aspect of the gambling story and the magic story was enhanced for us by Jason England. You probably all know Jason England, and I hope you've seen him perform. We're going to be talking to him in a few minutes as well about that aspect of the story and the Jonathan Green tale and how that directly links to what our familiarity with magic now, how that all goes back to that character of Jonathan Green. So enjoy Genii in April. Thanks for reading. Thanks for tuning in. And we'll see you all here next month. Thanks. Bye. We have an amazing feature in Genii this month, which is about Covent Garden Magicians. And I thought it would be wonderful for all our readers to get a chance to meet the author of that piece and the Covent Garden Magician himself, who he's writing about in his education on the streets of Covent Garden. And secretly, I wanted to do this because I wanted to meet him, because we almost met in London at a convention. He was nice enough after I was there to say, oh, I should have said hello, but I saw you on stage, and I was wondering if you were interested in an article about this group of Covent Garden magicians. And it turns out to be an amazing story. Yes, you've seen street magicians. You all know a little bit about street magic. Maybe some of you have done it. But it turns out that there's a community of street magicians in Covent Garden in the center of London's tourist area. And they've sort of figured out their own system of how they're doing it, their own friendships, their own support system. And Laurence has been part of that. This is Laurence Gibbons, who is also known as Abel of Cain and Abel, the performing team. And he wrote our feature about Covent Garden. So we have hooked up with him in the most painful way possible, technologically, so that we can meet him as he's working on a cruise ship in the Caribbean. So Laurence, thanks for doing this, and thanks for agreeing to be part of this. I appreciate your help with this. The surprise to me, I can only do the cliches about street magicians. I've seen them and admired them over the years. But I always think, oh, that's what you do when you can't do anything else, and that's how you learn it. And then hopefully you get good enough that you go and get a real job somewhere, a real performance job somewhere. But it was surprising to me that you had done these, including these cruise ships, and then you decided what you wanted to do was work on the street. And it was just interesting that you've kind of put all those pieces together. And I think what you're saying, what you're telling us, is a lot of performers do it that way.
Absolutely, yeah. it's addictive, I think, doing street shows. It's very, very difficult. I think the time that I first stepped into Covent Garden to perform, I'd been doing magic for 10 years, and I'd done magic outside at sort of fetes and festivals and fairs, and I'd done close-up magic gigs, and I'd done little theatre tours and things like that. And I thought, it's just the same. I'll just step out onto the street and I'll do my show, and everyone will love it and find it interesting. And wow, it is not that. You know, it's very humbling. You stand there with your little box of tricks and your microphone on, and you start talking and you try and build a crowd and pull people in, and that's difficult. And then you might get them in, and then they hopefully will stay. But every street performer's gone through the whole thing of you manage to get a crowd, but then you lose that crowd. So those are the real things you've got to learn is how to build an audience, how to keep an audience, and how to make them pay. And for me, I think it took months, honestly, to do it. I just moved to London. I was working at that point, writing for a food and drink magazine, and trying to get magic as a full-time career, which luckily it is for me and my brother now. But at that point, Covent Garden was an area that I could just go and do. No one was stopping me doing it. So I went, I think I was doing Saturday and Sunday in Covent Garden, and then 9 to 5, Monday to Friday in the office. And I just went, and I did just die on my arse for weeks on end, every weekend. You know, my girlfriend at the time was like, "Why are you doing this? You know, can't we just go out for a nice lunch?" No, I've got to go and hang out with all these, to her, weird magicians.
Right.
But it's the community, I think, that kept me there, Jim. You know, I went, and there is one of the sort of cliches with street performers is that they are not particularly welcoming, because, you know, the fact of the matter is, if you are the only person performing on the pitch that day, you can do as many shows as you want. But if there's 6 or 7 people, every new person that arrives restricts the amount of shows you can do and the amount of money you can make. So it's quite natural for a lot of street performers to be wary of new people coming.
Right.
Covent Garden and the area that I've always performed in, Magic Corner, I just found is the most welcoming place. I remember finishing my first show, and a guy who I'd been a bit intimidated by came up, shook my hand, and went, "Welcome to Covent Garden," you know. And
yeah,
I kind of needed that handshake and that blessing and that welcome. Magic Sam Hurst is obviously in the article, and he's one of my best friends. And you know, I met him on the street. I just was walking through Covent Garden. I watched his show, and I think I might have met him at Blackpool Magic Convention years before. And I just sort of went over to say hi, and he was just a lovely guy. And he was like, "You should try this." And the people there are very supportive of you. If you come and you genuinely want to be able to do a street show, people will be really, really supportive in Magic Corner. Right. You know, we've had people come, you know, and they put up their little phone and they just want to film content, and people are a little bit more wary of that. You know,
right?
It's
they're not really working there. They just want credit for working there. Yeah. That's
it. But yeah, if you're willing to come there and you get your half an hour and do your show, if you can do a show or whatever, people will be as encouraging as you could wish for, I think, in Covent.
It's interesting you talk about the competition in the system, and people who read the article will see. What surprised me a little is that, you know, there's really a system. And I suppose that's kind of done out of politeness, primarily. I mean, it's really to kind of put order to this chaos. You don't just have people wandering around doing shows. There's a queue, and you go back in the queue, and you're working with the other performers so that there's a cycle of people working.
Yeah, so there's 3 major pitches in Covent Garden. There's the West Piazza, and there's the North Hall. The North Hall is where sort of big circus acts tend to start. They might be doing a tightrope walk or a unicycle, climbing up a ladder and juggling, and they'll progress to the West Piazza. Escape artists will potentially work in those areas, and some magicians do. A good friend of mine, Paul DeBeck, only ever worked in those venues because he had this massive big show. But Magic Corner and those 2 pitches, you have to you have to put your pass into a drawer, and that is done a week in advance, so you know
wow.
the show's for the week.
Right.
Magic Corner is the Wild West. You rock up in the morning,
Okay.
and there is a scruffy piece of paper stuck to a lamppost, and you write your name on it. And if there isn't a scruffy piece of paper stuck to a lamppost, you find a scruffy piece of paper, you write your name on it, and you stick it to a lamppost, and then you're number one in
Right.
the queue at that point. And then you can start your show. And if somebody arrives before the end of your show, they will put their name down, and so on and so forth. Typically, when the weekends are the big days in Covent Garden, and I would typically only really ever go down and do Saturday, Sunday shows, and you could have anywhere from between sort of 5, 6, or 7 other magicians on.
Uh-huh.
So you are doing your show, and then you've got to hang around for 3 hours or so whilst these other shows happen before you can do your next show.
Right.
And I always like to do at least 2 shows, because the first show, it's earlier in the day. The people in Covent Garden are kind of only really getting used to the fact that they're there. You're kind of still warming up, even if you've done a show the day before. So the first show would be a good show. The second show is normally the best one. And then if you've got a stamp minute to wait around, I would like to do a third one.
Right.
And that is when actually the clientele and the people who are in Covent Garden change from very much families on a day out, going to the theatre, going to eat M&Ms at M&M World or whatever the hell they do.
Right.
And then when you get to sort of 5:30, 6 o'clock, you do have more people who are out, big groups drinking or whatever, and they might stop, and they're actually a respectable, fun crowd.
That's great. That's great. And you talk about how the show might be great, but then you always got another way to judge it at the end of the show as well, right? Meaning what's in the hat.
Absolutely. It's all about what's in the hat, unfortunately.
Right.
You can build a wonderful crowd. I would always have one child that would help in my show. And that was pretty much my build. I would kind of bring them up. I would normally do a tour de restoration with them, and then I would go into a billing selected piece of fruit, and the fruit is being thrown out amongst the audience. But then at the very center point is this kid, and the kid is there, and they've got to go get some money off their parent to bring back, and that ends up in a banana, an orange, or an apple, or whatever.
Right.
And you can have the most wonderful kid, and their family's really into it, and then you've got these little focal points, these little center points in your audience, maybe 3 or 4 big groups, and you brought them in, and they're smiling, and they're laughing, and they're clapping, and they're having a great time. If they don't pay, you go, oh, well, maybe that wasn't as good as I thought it was.
Right.
So unfortunately, it does all come down to counting what people have put in the hat, and everyone knows their biggest hat they've ever had. Everyone knows their biggest individual drop that they've ever had from someone. And it isn't about the money, the reason for going there. For me, It was a place that I could go and perform, and the camaraderie of everybody else that is there. And also, if I had didn't have many gigs, it's somewhere that you can go and you still feel like you're doing magic, and you get success.
And it's really
you get so much out of it.
It's really the acid test, isn't it? I mean, you're doing cruise ships, and you're doing comedy clubs, and you're doing all sorts of other shows. But I mean, I get the idea that it's one of those things that if you can do it there, you kind of know the rules of being able to get an audience anywhere, to be able to hold an audience. And that those other shows, are they easier because of that? Are they just different because of that? How does the street performing relate to working on a cruise ship?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's certainly similarities, because the audiences that I will perform to on a cruise ship, yes, they get a little paper through their door the night before that says, Cain and Abel are performing in the theatre tomorrow night.
Right.
And they think...
Go ahead.
And they think, oh, we'll go and watch that. But you are still essentially just 45 minutes of their holiday, and they've ambled into a theatre to watch it.
Right.
And although they are engaged, they're not super engaged in who you are, and they haven't booked a ticket to come and see you in their local town. in Covent Garden, people are walking through, they're maybe on their holiday or they're on their city break or they live in London, and you've got to engage as quickly as possible with everyone enough that they think, I am going to spend this portion of my day watching this.
Right.
And they buy into it and they think, I'm enjoying what this person is doing. I like the act. They're engaging. So there are similarities. But the main thing is, in Covent Garden or any street pitch, you have things such as you'll have a rowdy stag or hen crew, or you might have football fans.
Right.
There's a lot of football matches on in London, and so you might have some travelling fans down. Certainly when the Rugby Six Nations or if there's a World Cup on, people do use Covent Garden as an area to come and drink and be rowdy, and that can just totally ruin your show. A loud dog can just ruin your show.
Right.
In Covent Garden.
Right.
You don't have any of those. So actually, if you've just got one person that's maybe chatting to the person that they're sat with in a theatre, you've had to overcome so many bigger irritations than that.
Right.
That when you're in a venue, whether it's a cruise ship or comedy club or whatever, you're like, well, this is easy to get this person. This is one person I need to get back on side and stop talking.
Right.
And engage in the show. That's a lot easier than, okay, here's 20 people making loads of noise and 2 dogs fighting, or another street performer who's maybe new to the game and doesn't know that there's designated pitches for them to be playing their guitar, and they just pitch up near you and they're playing the guitar, and that's a disruptive. And you have to also deal with these in an authoritative way, but also in a really friendly, lovely way, because if you accidentally show face that you're grumpy and miserable, people aren't going to stay and watch the rest of the street show. So it does, having a really, really unengaged audience as you do on the street. These are people that are shopping, they don't want to stop, they don't want to pay money, at their very essence. When you are there in any room with any level of engaged audience, you learn how to deal with that, and I think it does improve you as a performer by going through that. What is a very humbling process, I think, trying to get an audience to stop and care on the street.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's got to be like the oldest way that anyone ever performed, and it's amazing that it's still not only there, but in this really historic area. I mean, you write a little bit about the history of Covent Garden as well, and how what's all happened there, how that all was the centerpiece of London community at one time, and the trends were set there, the styles were set there, and that's still where the tourists go and encounter entertainers today. So
absolutely. There's a pub, the Punch and Judy pub, that is named because this is where the first recorded street performance was a Punch and Judy show. And that was in the 1600s. So street performers have been coming here ever since. The area has, it was originally a place for royalty, but when they were driven out of Covent Garden, the artists and they came in, and it has gone through these changes. It's a place with posh, fancy shops, and people are there to buy, designer handbags or whatever. Having all of the theatres around, you do have these people who their sole reason for coming to Covent Garden is to watch, Wicked or The Lion King or whatever, and they're there to see live entertainment that evening or that afternoon in a big theatre. So when they walk past someone doing it on the street, they're like, well, this is what we want. This is what we want to see.
Right.
And it is. There has been issues, and there will always be issues with Westminster Council wanting to control it a little bit more. There's a decibel level that they bring in, that they have people that come around and record, make sure we're not making too much noise.
Oh, wow.
We're speaking here on Apple products, so I can't talk too badly about them, but the Apple Store.
Oh, really? They're They're fussy.
It's right by Magic Corner, and if you're making too much noise, they will send these council officers down to shut it down. If your crowd is so big that it's by their doorway, they will make a fuss about that as well. So, you've got these huge brands and these huge businesses who are paying so much money to rent these, premises and sell their wares. And they do seem to be a bigger voice a lot of the time in trying to control things there. But it's such a huge community, the Covent Garden Street performers, that they really have put their foot down and made sure that they are protected and that they are still a part of it, because it is a part of that London history. It's a part of Covent Garden's history. Street performers have been there. People go there for it. When I first started doing magic, my grandparents were a magic act, so they gave me, all these magic books and old magic magazines, even Genii magazines. The first ones I read were printed before I was born, and my granddad passed down to me. And my dad, so it's my mum's parents who did the magic. My dad he didn't have anything that he felt he could offer us, but he'd always gone to London and he visited Covent Garden as a kid. So he took me and my brother down to Covent Garden, and we just spent the afternoon watching street shows. We went to Davenport's magic shop, and it was something that he just knew they'll be there. He didn't go on the internet and check, are street performers still in Covent Garden? He just got off the train how he'd remembered doing it 20 years before, and we just wandered down, and there they all are. And on any given day in Covent Garden, you can see the cups and balls, you can see someone escape from a straitjacket, you can see someone walking on a tightrope, you can see unicyclists juggling knives, you can see unbelievable mime and really beautiful sort of bits of dance and mime. You see classical music, and you can see break dancers. It's every kind of performance art is happening in Covent Garden, and the surrounding areas. Trafalgar Square and Leicester Square are also, people will go down there and do those other pitches as well. So it's great that performers are still there, and they are still fighting, and they are still making a living doing it.
Yeah, no, it's a great story. I mean, I've been there and admired those performers, but I have to tell you, my whole perspective of it changed after reading your story and reading about what you and your friends are doing there. And I'll be back, and the first thing I'm going to do is look for you guys, the cast of characters that you included. I mean, it's really, I kind of feel like I know them a little more now, and you kind of understand what those people are doing, and it's really inspiring. I think it's inspiring to a lot of people who just have a sense of that and don't necessarily understand all the pieces that go into it. So it's great. I know our readers will enjoy it. Hey, thanks very much for doing this. Thanks for writing the story, number one. Please say hi to your brother and say hi to those guys when you get back to London. And good luck on the cruise ship.
I will do, and they're all delighted. A lot of magicians will get featured in magazines or whatever, but there isn't that much of a look on street performing. So a lot of these guys who I messaged to speak to for the article, they were firstly really amazed that Genii wanted to cover it. So it's really cool. And everyone's delighted.
So I got it. The old days of Genii, they used to say, "Oh, please tell advertisers that you saw the ad in Genii," because they wanted to promote all that stuff. So I have to tell our readers now that when you're in Covent Garden and you see these guys, you say, "Hey, I read about you in Genii magazine." So that does us a favor, and that's a little pat on the back for them too. So that's great. Hey, thanks so much, Laurence. This was really fun, and I appreciate you putting this all together for us.
It's a pleasure. Cheers, Jim.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm here with Jason England, and we've got him here talking to Genii readers about a feature specifically in the April issue about Jonathan Green, the reformed gambler. We had an amazing story come in through the transom at Genii by Paul Heller, which was really an Americana story about Jonathan Green, who was a gambler, a reformed gambler. He was a figure in American literature and American history. And the story of Green is an amazing one. And it's also a story that's significant to magicians for a number of reasons, for a number of really significant reasons. So when this happened, I just have to say that one of the nicest things that can happen when you're kind of sniffing around in stories that are slightly obscure like this, where the pieces don't quite come together, is to have someone tap you on the shoulder and say, "Oh, maybe I can explain how a couple of those things fit together." And if that person is Jason England, with his knowledge of gambling and cards and sleight of hand and historical subjects, that's about as good as that gets. So we put in a call to Jason and said, would you care to write a little bit about this for our Magic audience? And he did an amazing sidebar, which you see in the April issue, tying all this together. And then we also got some amazing materials from Lee Asher about the history of playing cards to illustrate it. And so it's a really fascinating piece. And if you don't know the name Jonathan Green, I'm not terribly surprised, because it's a kind of obscure name in the world of magic, but it shouldn't be. And fortunately, Jason will explain that to us. So Jonathan Green, I mean, I know that was an interesting subject to you, although maybe not your first interest, a little bit obscure. How did you find all that and put all those pieces together?
So I've known of Green for, I mean, probably 20 years or so. He is an important figure in early American gambling writing. He is the first person to mention cheating at poker in his the first edition of his first book, which was called An Exposure of the Arts and Miseries of Gambling. Came out in 1843, went through multiple printings, many printings, maybe a dozen. I'm not entirely sure how many printings that book went through.
They were really popular books, weren't they?
Very popular book. I don't have a first edition Green because they're not rare in bookseller terms, but they are uncommon. You know, if you wanted one, probably take you a month to track one down. You'd spend $2,000 or $3,000 to get a hold of it. But I have a fourth edition of his book here. This is An Exposure of the Arts and Miseries of Gambling, or just Miseries of Gambling is all that's on the spine here. And this is the first book to mention cheating at poker. Again, first edition, 1843. It's not the first book to mention poker. That's about 5 years earlier in a book called Dragoon Campaigns to the Rocky Mountains, written by a guy named Hildreth. But Hildreth just sort of mentions the game in passing, like, oh, and the fellas on the trail were playing this new game, poker. That's all he says. And then Green comes along just 5 years later and talks about, well, yes, but it was a cheating game almost from the word go. And here's all the different methods that you can cheat at it. And in fact, that's so early that poker wasn't even in Hoyle yet. And remember, Hoyle was 200 years old by this time. Hoyle had been around for a while, his series of books. And poker doesn't get mentioned until 1845 in Hoyle. And in this little bitty edition right here, which is not much bigger than a playing card, actually. It's a very small book, but that's the Anner's edition of Hoyle, the first time poker is mentioned in Hoyle. So very new game, but Green, between Hildreth and in Dragoon Campaigns and Green in Arts and Miseries, clearly establishes that poker was a game popular enough to get written about in the late 1830s, early 1840s, possibly even a little earlier than that. But the documentation gets a little slim, but yeah. So Green was sort of the first, at least in English, that we're aware of the reformed gamblers, and these are gamblers that had been making a living gambling, and then for whatever reason decided to change their tune and start preaching against gambling, which they did. And I was never all that interested in Green because he's a temperance author. And I don't like having to sift through thou shalt not gamble because God says so. I'm more interested in the technique.
Moralizing, yeah.
I want to know the raw information, how they were doing things. And so for a long time, I just wasn't hot on Green. I had one of his books. I had read it. But when you guys asked for this article, it really made me dig into his writings a little better. And I actually wound up reading books of his online that I didn't even have physical copies of. And now I have a much deeper appreciation for what Green was able to accomplish back then. Even though he had different goals, he still gives us a lot of early sources for things.
Right.
He mentions second dealing. The first known description of a strike second deal in English, published in America, is right there in his book. And he also mentioned stripper decks, a couple different kinds of stripper decks in his book, including the standard wedge stripper deck that we're familiar with today. He mentions that.
So while we're talking about games and while we're talking about Green's specialties, what he wrote about and what he was known for, can you tell us a little about thimble rigging? Thimble rigging is very mysterious to me. And am I right in saying that's the three shell game? It's not really the three shell game, but it's pretty close, isn't it?
Conceptually, it is.
Okay.
Yes. So it's, it's the three shell game without walnut shells. They just using thimbles. I don't know if the three shell game with walnut shells would predate thimble rigging or the other way around.
Right.
But yes, conceptually, it's the same thing. Three little covers, a pea of some sort, and move them around and try to find the pea kind of thing. So
right.
yes,
and this is kind of how this is what he was known for at a certain time in his career.
Certainly one of the things he was known for that he writes about. And he writes about thimble rigging, and he mentions another person in his books. I'm blanking on the name right now, but it's actually in the article.
That's right.
Submitted to Genii. He writes about this other personality who was sort of the king of thimble rigging at that time. So Green does write about him.
Yeah, and again, that it's a game you can't win.
Correct. Well, yeah, I mean, Ricky Jay made the point in one of his KCRW radio spots that it's not even a game. It's a con dressed up as a game. You have no chance to win, because even if you were to stumble upon the right thimble, they're just not going to pay you. They'll come up with some excuse not to pay you. So I've jokingly said before, and so have other people, that same with three-card Monte, we could play three-card Monte with the cards face up, and you're still not going to get paid, so not much of a game there. Right.
When gambling games were rough and ready.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you make an amazing connection in your piece between how this all comes together, a kind of, link, the dominoes falling from one to the other, of how this guy Green, who, is previously maybe a literary figure or in the world of gambling, suddenly is now kind of front and center in our magic world.
A little bit, yeah. So first of all, Green was a lecturer. He traveled all around lecturing on the evils of gambling. Mm-hmm. And probably to drive home his lectures, he would do something that wasn't completely honest. He took a claim, a claim that had an element of truth to it, but he exaggerated the claim. So the claim that Green had is that every single deck of cards sold in America at that time, in the mid 1800s, was factory marked. Right. Okay, that is not true.
Yeah, an amazing conspiracy theory.
But there's a grain of truth to it.
Okay,
all of the American makers of that time period. Take Thomas Krehor, for instance, who I believe was a Boston area maker. Mm-hmm. Thomas Krehor, making cards in the mid 1800s, he had his back design, maybe more than one, but he had a Krehor back design. And gamblers would get some other printer to print a facsimile of the Krehor back, but secretly marked. Okay. So it's true that there were factory marked decks that looked like regular decks. That part is absolutely true. But what Green did is he exaggerated that point a little bit by saying that they're all marked that way. Mm-hmm. That part's not true, okay? Just like you and I could probably rummage around in a junk drawer and come up with a factory marked bicycle deck. That doesn't mean they're all marked, you know? And so, but by doing so, by telling the people that they were all marked, I'm sure he frightened some people away from gambling, and that was his goal. But what's interesting is that he would often in his lectures send someone out of the lecture hall, run down the street to the stationery store to buy a deck of cards and bring it to him, shuffle it up and hand it to him. And he would, I've got a deck of cards right here, oddly enough. Okay. He would take that deck of cards and he would hold a card up and he would, announce whatever it was. He would announce 5 of hearts. And then he would hold the next one up and he would announce 2 of hearts. Right. What he was doing was using a hidden mirror in his table or lectern to just catch a reflection of it, and then he would pretend to read the back design. So he was cheating at his cheating expose. And what's interesting about that is that became a card trick. So in the 1930s, Ralph Hull, I'm going to read something to you here.
Sure.
In the 1930s, Ralph Hull, who we've all heard about, an early American 20th century author, in More Eye Openers, Impromptu Card Tricks for Parlor, Club, or Stage, 1933. He writes, he has a trick in here called Any Deck Read from the Card Backs. And he writes, here's a trick I have performed for 20 years. And because I have not found it to be generally known amongst amateur and professional magicians, I am including it in this series. Is it true that any deck can be read from the backs of the cards? I do not know to whom credit for this unique feat belongs. Well, I do. It belongs to Jonathan Harrington Green, who wasn't even trying to do a card trick. He was trying to drive home a point.
Right.
But here, in 1933, from mid 40s, 80 years later, right. Ralph Hull's doing this as a card trick. We still do it to this day as card tricks, especially those of us that do gambling material. I'll often take someone's deck and go, these are marked, and either right. peek at a card or get a little bit ahead of them and pretend to read some marks and then hand it back to them. But I'm doing it tongue in cheek, and the person I do that to almost always realizes that they just saw a card trick. They didn't see an actual demonstration. But Green did it as an actual demonstration and inadvertently created a card trick.
Interesting. Wow.
And he also was the first person to combine gambling expose writing with magic tricks. So this book is an 1868 Dickon Fitzgerald reprint of his book. They called it Gambler's Tricks with Cards. It actually has a slightly longer title than that in its first edition form. Plenty of gambling books before this one, right. Plenty of magic books before this one. But this is the first book to combine gambling expose stuff and card tricks, at least as far as I'm aware.
Right.
And so, this is 50-something years before Erdnase, who does the same thing. If you remember in The Expert at the Card Table, in the preface to The Expert at the Card Table, Erdnase rants a little bit about the mealy-mouthed pretensions of piety. You can tell that he didn't care so much for the temperance writing. He was interested in the raw moves, the raw techniques, and how they did it. Same as me.
Right.
And so he kind of takes a shot at these reformed gamblers. And I've always believed, although I can't prove this, I've always believed that he was taking a shot directly at Green, because he talks about the reformed gamblers. And Jonathan Harrington Green billed himself as the reformed gambler, not a reformed gambler, but the reformed gambler.
Right.
So I think Erdnase was taking a shot at Green a little bit. I think it's only speculation, but I think it's very plausible that Erdnase's book leans in a certain direction away from temperance and into technique. He's leaning into the moves and the technique and how to do it, as opposed to why not to do it, which is, Green and Quinn and all the different temperance reformed gambler writers before him.
Right.
So I think it's reasonable to make a case that Green affected Erdnase.
Yeah.
And we know Erdnase affected Vernon. So without Green, do we get the Erdnase that we got in 1902? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it colored sort of the approach that he took to some degree. And
right.
Without Erdnase, do we get the Vernon that we got?
Right.
Again, who knows? We know how much that book affected him. We know how much that book gave him entree into the New York card scene in the late 19-teens and into the 1920s. So it's impossible to know for sure, but it is very likely that Green affected us today through Erdnase and through Vernon.
Yeah, that's a real straight line there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah.
I don't have hard proof of it, but I mean, all the pieces are there.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Now, it's a great story. It's a really interesting story that's, it's been there all the time. I mean, I because I knew Ricky Jay, Green was a character in Ricky's pantheon of characters. for various reasons. So I used to hear him talk a little bit about Green, but even to me, it was, he was a slightly mysterious character because it was all through layers of Americana and literature,
Sure.
and those connections are interesting, and they're not obvious to you until you put it together like that in terms of
Right.
all the combinations.
Yeah, I went to Ricky's house one time, and I was very fortunate to get a tour from him of his collection. And I'll never forget a phrase that he said to me, because he asked me, he said, "What are you interested in?" And I said, "Well, I'm interested in gambling and cheating, and I'm interested in card magic, primarily close-up card magic, stage card magic, not as much."
Right.
And he said, "Okay." Well, he goes, "Well, I've got a lot of both of those." And he points to his shelf of Green, which was this long.
Right.
And he goes, "As you can see, I'm strong in Green." And that was his way of saying, I have a solid Jonathan Harrington Green collection here. And he was strong in Green. He had one of everything, multiple copies of some things, and all in terrific shape.
Yeah.
So Ricky was certainly an expert on Jonathan Harrington Green. And to be honest, I didn't appreciate Green at that time. I knew of him. I knew that he had written the early books, but the temperance stuff just kept me from really diving deep into his writings. And you guys asking me to write this sidebar for this article is what fixed all of that, because now I had to read a little bit more about Green to dig up some things. And what I realized is that I had not given Green enough credit for the really early stuff that's in his book. I mean, early mentions of, the strike second deal, different types of stripper decks, explanations of cheating at Faro and things of that nature. So much early stuff traces back through him. Now, he didn't invent it, but he's cataloging it for the period. And so really, really important guy in early gambling, and therefore early magic / gambling expose work, for sure.
No, it's a great story, and I appreciate you diving into this with us on short notice, putting these pieces together. If you guys have a chance, I hope you've had a chance to meet Jason, talk to him a little bit about sleight of hand and certainly, gambling history. And best of all is if you ever get a chance to sit down and watch him perform, because that's kind of where all the pieces come together and you begin to realize how all this influence has created this kind of rarefied ability. So I've had a chance to see that. It's amazing. And I would urge our readers and watchers to go out of your way to get a chance to see Jason ply his trade when it comes to magic, because it's a great.
Thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for helping us again, and we'll see you back in the pages of Genii at some point. We've got some scheme to get you back and contribute again. I know, but we'll do our best. Thanks, Jason.
Understood. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.